I'm sure most of you did not expect to see the church historian standing up here today, and honestly, neither did I. But there is a very good reason. So first of all, today is Transfiguration Sunday, as we heard. It's a time when we recognize how Jesus was transformed by the Holy Spirit. But it's also Black History Month. And next week we'll be marking this with a special coffee hour after the service. So as a little prelude to that, I wanted to talk for a moment about our church and our commitment to being an open and affirming congregation. Now, I'm willing to bet that you think you know where I'm going to go with this, but you'd be wrong. When we say we welcome everybody, that feels pretty basic to us. I mean, here in our congregation, the City of Albany, 2026, it's one of our core commandments, one of our core basic fundamental things. We welcome everybody because we believe everyone is equal in the eyes of God. This should not be a radical concept. Just because somebody is one way or another doesn't make them any less of a person. It's what Jesus preached. It's what's in the Bible. He literally spent his time with the poor and the outcast. And you'd think that with his ability to turn water into wine, he would have been welcome at every VIP party downtown. But that's not where he chose to be. Because everybody is worthy. Everybody has a place at the same table. And that has been our commitment since our founding over 175 years ago. But I want you to think about what that really looks like, because that has not always been a popular idea. So congregational churches actually began in 1620 with the Pilgrims, and from the start they were governed by the people. Not bishops, not popes. The congregation decided what happened in its own church. The church reflected everybody who was gathered within it. That's why we have boards of trustees, a board of deacons. Even in my role as the moderator, I'm just here to make sure things run smoothly and nobody kills each other. Now, the flip side to all of this, because there's no bishop, there's no pope, there's nobody telling us what to do, there's nobody also saying that all congregational churches have to do one thing. All congregational churches must do this other thing. None of that happens, so keep that in mind because it's important. So fast forward a couple of hundred years, and new congregational churches were popping up along the western frontier and in the south. Now, at the same time, the Presbyterians were doing the exact same thing. So in 1801, we actually partnered with the Presbyterians on the frontier, sharing resources, sharing clergy to spread the word of the Lord, and that worked for a while. But eventually it became clear that our theologies didn't quite match up. And within the Presbyterian Church itself, there was actually a major split developing between the conservative old school and the more reformed-minded new school. And one of the biggest points of contention was the issue of slavery. Some Presbyterians argued that slavery was morally wrong and absolutely a matter for the church, but others insisted that this was a secular issue, not something the church should ever be involved in, and it was perfectly fine to support slavery, be a slave owner, and also still follow the teachings of Jesus. So by 1852, the Congregationalists realized that our partnership with these Presbyterians wasn't really working out anymore. So quite honestly, we needed to figure out who we were. The 19th century looked very different from the world of the Pilgrims in 1620. And remember, not all congregational churches were doing the same thing. So church leaders from every single congregation were invited to this convention of congregational leaders to ask, what defines this denomination? Where do we see our future? What do we stand for? And most important of all of that was to address the real hot button issue of the day, slavery, and decide where we stood as a church on that issue, if anywhere. Now, believe it or not, this convention, this moment of incredible importance, was held right here in the city of Albany at First Congregational Church. Now, let me give you a little bit of context. So 1852, Albany itself, the city of Albany, was a major transportation and political hub. It was the perfect intersection of the canal, the steamboat, rail. Meanwhile, First Congregational Church had only been around for 2 years. We were founded in 1850. We were still a brand new congregation, meeting in a building that had previously been a Presbyterian church from 1795, which, by the way, was the oldest church building in the city of Albany. We still have the original deed to that church building, older than St. Mary's, older than First Reformed, but I digress. Despite our young age, and we actually had an incredibly large congregation, and our minister was Reverend Dr. Ray Palmer, a noted theologian, a poet, and a scholar whose hymn, "My Faith Looks Up to Thee," continues to be translated into languages around the world to this day. So even though there were a couple of other congregational churches in the area, we were the only one in the city of Albany with a robust membership and a very well-respected minister. So naturally, we were chosen to host this convention. Now, as I said, this was an enormous deal. It put Albany on the map for the entire congregational denomination. And it put First Congregational Church on the map as a like-minded, active, vibrant church. And the city took this very seriously. The convention was considered so important that the city of Albany actually put leather on the cobblestones surrounding our church building so that the sound of the horses' hooves wouldn't disrupt the sound in the convention. More than 400 ministers and delegates poured into the city of Albany. Among them was Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, one of the most influential anti-slavery movements in the nation. He had raised money to buy enslaved people's freedom, and his church actually sent rifles called Beecher's Bibles into anti-slavery settlers in Kansas. His sister, Harriet Beecher Stowe, we know, had just published Uncle Tom's Cabin, so the Beecher family was already shaping the national conversation in every direction when it came to the issue of slavery. The convention was also attended by Reverend Mark Hopkins, president of Williams College, and prominent ministers from across the Northeast and the Midwest. And it wasn't just Congregationalists. We invited pastors from other denominations in the area to join and meet with us as honorary attendees. And tucked away in the archives is a little detail that's left out of the published convention proceedings, something that was sort of lost to the history of over time, showing just how profile this convention really was. The Albany Argus reported in 1852 that the chairman of the convention read aloud a telegraph he received from the chief of police of Albany, warning that a band of New York City pickpockets was on the way from New York City, dressed up as clergy so they could blend in with everybody else. It was at that point, according to the report, that one of the actual clergymen at the conference rose from his seat and suggested that the delegates actually should send their condolences to these naive pickpockets who thought that the ministers had any money worth stealing in the first place, because if they were looking for treasures, this was not the convention to attack. So in October 1852, the convention met at First Congregational Church of Albany in our former building, and it focused on cooperation, missionary work, expansion, and defining the congregational denomination. But the big issue, the one everybody wanted to talk about, was slavery. Specifically, how anti-slavery did a church need to be in order to remain in Christian fellowship with the denomination? It's a big issue. Delegates debated questions like, should churches tolerate members who own slaves? Should ministers refuse communion to slave owners? Should the denomination have a formal anti-slavery stance to begin with? And one of the most important outcomes of this convention was the creation of a fund to help build new churches and to provide loans to existing congregations who were struggling with debt. But should that include churches in slaveholding states? Or should the denomination exclude all financial support to those churches that recognize slaveholders as members? Taking it a step further, should we even be building churches in those states where slavery is legal? It's a big question. Some argued we should wait until slavery was outlawed, and then we should invest in those communities. But others pushed back. They insisted that instead of waiting for slavery to disappear, waiting by the sidelines, we should send ministers into those places to preach the gospel with the explicit intent of destroying slavery in the end. As Dr. Peters put it at the time, we go and we preach the gospel in the face of slavery. Reverend Blanchard actually echoed this sentiment that slavery wasn't simply something an evil to be managed or mitigated or worked around. It was, in his words, a sin. Whenever a man held another human being as property for his own use, Blanchard said, that was a sin that required repentance. Several major voices of the convention had already taken public stands against the recent fugitive slave law. That required the return of escaped slaves to their captors. Among them was our very own Reverend Dr. Ray Palmer, minister of First Congregational Church, who actually argued that the fugitive slave law violated Christian conscience, which is pretty extreme. Dr. Bacon then reminded the convention slavery had actually become a political question in every single state, and beneath all the politics was a simple moral reality. The issue, he said, was more than just changing the law. That was easy. It was more about getting to the heart of the matter by directing efforts towards those who thought it was okay to hold their fellow men as slaves. He argued that even a child knows when an injustice is done to them. Slaveholders knew they were committing an injustice and continued anyway. Bacon urged the delegates to speak to the plain moral facts, to name slavery for the wrong that it was, and every action of the church, he insisted, had to rest upon the simple truth that no law can make it right to hold another human being as your slave. And then he added, in a true mic drop moment, that if any man could not understand that, then he himself should be sold as a slave until he did. For Bacon, the point was very simple. Such a violation of another human being had no place in the life of the church. Anyone who persisted in it, he argued, should not be welcomed into fellowship. This led to a bold resolution that wherever the gospel is faithfully preached, it would be used to oppose the works of the devil, specifically slavery. That was the language that was used at the time. That's how strong the feeling was about slavery. And on that basis, the missionary society would give aid to churches in slave-holding states, but only if those churches used their pulpits to awaken people's moral sense about slavery and help bring about its speedy abolition. In other words, the expectation was not that ministers should avoid preaching in slave-holding states, nor that they should simply declare that slavery is wrong, you're all idiots, but instead they're to use the gospel itself to show why slavery was wrong, drawing on scripture, drawing on reason, and on basic moral values shared by people of good faith, and to urge slaveholders to end the practice themselves because it was the right thing to do. Instead of writing people off, ministers were to preach the gospel into that evil, placing it squarely before people and trusting them to change course. The resolution even went so far as to say that if a minister lacked the freedom to be able to speak his convictions, or if the people just refused to hear him outright, then he should leave that place and shake the dust from his feet as he went. We didn't say anything subtly. This was a remarkably bold statement for 1852. That conviction shaped everything that followed. It guided the debates, it guided the resolutions, and the expectations placed on every single minister in the Congregational denomination. The churches were taking a very clear stand that slavery was a moral evil incompatible with Christian faith. Now let me put this into context again. This was 1852, 9 years before the Civil War, 13 years before the 13th Amendment made slavery illegal. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 that I mentioned was dividing the country. Northern resistance was erupting as federal marshals seized alleged fugitives in free states. That might sound a little familiar to what's going on right now. Uncle Tom's Cabin was revealing the cruelty of slavery to millions of readers, while the South continued to insist that slavery was its rightful institution, and that nobody had the authority to question how enslaved people were treated, and they were going to continue doing what they wanted to do. In fact, the South actually criminalized abolitionist speech. Anybody speaking out against slavery could be imprisoned, tarred and feathered, or even lynched. And here's the Congregational denomination and First Congregational Church of Albany. This church mandating that clergy go out and speak against slavery, not just in the North, where most people already agree, but in the South, directly to slave owners who we knew were going to disagree with us and where things would probably get ugly. The church was committing itself to oppose the evils of slavery, grounded in its stance and the teachings of the gospel. And this was a huge deal, and it's relevant to today. Because the same sentiment of inequality the churches faced in 1852 is still present. Just like in the 19th century, we still see groups of radical conservatives who pick and choose from the Bible what they want, weaponizing it to justify prejudices and racism, demonizing people based on ethnicity and immigration status while claiming superiority over those who don't look like them or sound like them or live like them. And just like in 1852, the sad reality is that many of these voices have never actually read the Bible in the first place, or they would realize that all of that is contrary to what the Bible and Jesus actually say we should be doing. And just to prove my point, I'm now going to quote every Bible verse that justifies discrimination. And while we're at it, here are all the times that Jesus mentions the evils of homosexuality, the superiority of white Europeans, and when it's totally okay to put somebody else into slavery. But what it does say is this: love thy neighbor as thyself. It is a moral baseline, not an optional virtue, and it dismantles every system of harm that exists. So what's the takeaway here? This is more than a history lesson, perfectly timed for Transfiguration Sunday and Black History Month. So consider this. In 1852, most people attended church of some kind, some denomination. But in 2026, churches compete for attendance, for members, for donations. Many churches are so afraid of offending anybody that they water everything down and they don't take a stand. What's left are platitudes and vague talk about angels and fish without ever challenging people to be transformed, to be better, to do better. People who go often feel like they've gained their gold star just by attending and listening to a sermon that they only half listen to, and that somehow it allows them to continue with their mistreatment of others. And this isn't theoretical. We see it playing out in real time. Our nation's leader, actually, who claims to be a devout Christian, but when the Episcopal Bishop of Washington asked him to show compassion to others, he called her stupid and demanded an apology. She was literally quoting the Bible, just as the Congregationalists did in 1852. Same thing. Church is not about just showing up so you feel better about yourself. It is about being the church in your community. It's about hearing what's being said and putting that into action in your daily life. Part of the purpose of the church, this church, is to challenge you, to transform you in the way that Jesus was transformed, to understand what Christianity means in 2026, to be proactive, to speak out against injustice. Our pulpit has always been a place to confront what is wrong, to encourage people to stand up in the face of oppression, and to treat your neighbor as yourself. Our archives are filled with programs that brought together different cultures and different communities. We held supper forums here with people from Russia and China during the height of the Cold War. We were the first denomination to ordain black ministers, the first to ordain women, the first to ordain LGBTQ people. We pioneered interfaith services with our Jewish and Unitarian neighbors in the 1920s. And today we continue to support the work of the Capital District Latinos and the immigrant community despite the pressure from ICE and from others. It's very easy to speak out against evil from the safety of a sanctuary filled with like-minded people here in the North, in a blue state, but it does take faith and courage to speak out when evil is staring you in the face. When you're in the South preaching against slavery to a room full of slave owners, or when you're standing as an ally with a marginalized group. And that's exactly what Jesus calls us to do. It's what makes the church just as relevant today as it was in 1852. So as we celebrate Black History Month, we celebrate the incredible accomplishments and the advances of the Black community and all that we've achieved together, but we also recognize that the work is far from over. Just as in 1852, our job is to be the church in our community and to stand with those who need our help. And if we keep doing that from the pulpit and in our daily lives, it will make a difference, just as it did in 1852. And I will leave you with this quote, one of my favorites. Not from the Bible, it's from Captain America. It doesn't matter what the press says. It doesn't matter what the politicians or the mob say. It doesn't matter if the whole country decides something wrong is something right. This nation was founded on one principle, the requirement that we stand for what we believe no matter the odds or the consequences. When the mob and the press and the whole world tell you to move, your job is to plant yourself like a tree beside the river of truth and tell the whole world, no, you move. Thank you.